let's say that we have been friends for years, many years, and maybe we don't see each other often, but we are connected, we're bonded, we have a history with each other. And we meet and we look at each other and you start to laugh and you say, I will never forget your birthday party. In that instant, my brain whips out the, well, I guess we would call the file folder now, the folder in the brain that says birthday. And suddenly the two of us are joined in time and space, and we're enjoying this connection. And for a few moments, I get to relive that birthday party, but I get to relive it through you vicariously. I'm getting to see it again through your eyes, your perceptions, the things that you remember, the things that were important, the twists in the plot, so to speak. And they're joined with my memory. And we recreate that birthday party in that moment. What's interesting is that in that moment, I'm holding you and you are holding me. And it's as if we had a mystical power over each other. Charles, I think it was Charles Cooley, said, I am not who I think I am. I am not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. In other words, our relationships are so vitally important to our identity as a person and to that sense of self that we have as a person. This is why memory is so profound and powerful, and why it is so hard when people are losing their memory. So now let's take a twist on that story. Let's say that we meet again, and you say exactly the same thing. I will never forget your birthday party. And you start to laugh, but I don't respond. In fact, it's as if my eyes kind of look past you, and in that moment, you're left going, what do I do? Do I continue with the story? Do I share more? Are they listening? Do they get this? Welcome to late stage. This is the conundrum of late stage that we often face. And I often refer to this stage with my team as the stage of abandonment, and I don't say that with any malice. I fully understand and get it. It's hard for family members to continue to connect, or it's hard for friends, and those people many times just seem to disappear and they disconnect from us. You know, animals get together for the purpose of propagation and survival. It's all about biology. But we as humans are very, very different. The moment we're born, we're immediately placed in the arms of somebody. And that characterizes our life for the rest of our lives. We live in that connected relationship, being carried and we carrying others for the rest of our lives. And so what's so profound about that is that we actually entrust our happiness, many of the things related to our own intimacy and our own vulnerability to others. And that's why when we start to talk about the late stages, it's how do we find this person? Where is this person? How do I connect with this person that I've done journey with for a long time? I often share the story that when I was in my learning stages, I had my office in the center of a community of memory care community, and there were predominantly all late stage people. And I saw this woman walking across the open area, and she was coming towards my office, tears already streaming down her face. And I just opened my arms and she just fell into my arms sobbing, why, tell me, why won't my mother just die? Now, unless you've done this journey, you would think, how cruel, how harsh. But the reality is that for this woman who was consistently coming to see her mom, she couldn't find her mother. And the holder and the repository of all those memories and that way of connecting with her own self-identity was lost, or so she thought. Eventually, I looked at her and I said, your mother brings me great joy. And I wasn't making that up. I connected with her mother every day. I had to actually have a connection with her. It was like I had to have a fix. But I had learned to communicate and connect in a different way. The daughter had this long-term relationship. I said, we can learn this together. And you know what? She did, and enjoyed those days with her mother. Memory links us to the past, but hope gives us eyes to see the person that's tucked inside that dirt suit. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That relationship that many times goes beyond words, to that ability to connect with people that goes beyond that mere, what we would call superficial exchange that we do so easily. But we can do this. So let's start to talk about this and work through the materials together today, all right? We're going to have some things that we're going to look at together and understand that the world is experienced through the senses. Impairment in memory increases. Language becomes more basic. Incontinence is typically an issue somewhere along the line. And dependence on the caregiver increases. Physical abilities diminish. All of these are the symptoms that we have to live into and that we have to manage as we're going through this. There's kind of a traditional way of thinking about the late stage as we progress through this. And that is that there are multiple losses, and we really try to focus on the physical management of the person's care as much as possible. And this is what has allowed us to be able to care for people longer and keep people more alive. And I mean that physically, but also in many different ways, because we are so focused on that care, which is so vitally important. But in that process, many times we have neglected that emotional life of the person or the spiritual life of that person. And it's all a part of what we need to wrap into our consideration when we're talking about caring for a person in the late stages. Listen to Mary as she talks about this whole exploration of doing this part of the journey, and the person isn't truly lost to the disease.
Another common misconception in the later stages is that the person is lost to the disease, that they're no longer aware of their environment, they're no longer aware of the people around them who love them, and I think that is a misconception. While the disease is affecting a lot of these cognitive abilities and maybe has taken away their ability to speak or communicate verbally, they're still the same person. That personhood remains, and we hear about families who will see glimpses of that. Who will have moments with their loved one where they knew their loved one knew who they were, and they really connected with them. So I think in the later stages there are these assumptions that the person is entirely gone, and that's not necessarily the case.
Oh, it is absolutely not the case. The person isn't lost to the disease, even though that many times this is a common misconception. That person, that self, is still there. It is still trying to communicate. We just need to figure out how to link with that person in a different way. So we want to take a holistic view of this late stage that may be different than some of the things we've heard in the past. Obviously, we want to incorporate the physical aspects of care, which are so vitally important, but we also want to include emotional and spiritual aspects of that care. And we want to increase that focus on the person's self that may not be obvious to us, but that is still there. That person's passions, that person's character, those things are still there and they're intact. I often used to tell my team that we are far more than a toileting schedule. And because we focus so much on the care aspect, we often forget the whole person. And so we want to individualize the care that is necessary and tailor it to the person that we are in relationship with. Sam is going to talk about this as well, and he talks about that concept of self in dementia.
I think the biggest misconception that people have about the self and dementia is that dementia equals a loss of self. And that characterization is inaccurate for a lot of different reasons. First of all, the self is more than just memory, and just because somebody loses their memory doesn't mean that they lose their self. The self is still there, but they just might need some help communicating their self to other people. A lot of times people with Alzheimer's disease will be defined by their current self, so by their self that's impacted by the disease. And what's important is that we remember who somebody's been their whole life, so their lifelong self, and not just the self that's affected by the disease. So we think about who somebody's been their whole life, and we think about ways to weave that information into every interaction and activity that we do with those people.
Let me just highlight a few things that Sam points out it's worth listening to again for sure. And that is that dementia does not equal the loss of the self, and that we are many times focusing on the person that's in front of us right now or the extent of the memories that we have with them, but that we need to look at a long view of this person's lives and all of the things that contributed to making them who they are today. And sometimes that is a challenge for a child, for example, because you didn't know your mother or your father when they were 5 or 9. But maybe there are things and glimpses of that you did get, and you need to start to recall what some of those things are. Who they are still is there, and it is not lost to the disease for sure. Now, there are going to be obvious changes in the caregiving role that start to take place because there may be some personality shifts that occur, and they may kind of go in different directions than what you were expecting. And those traits that you may have assumed for years have always been there may make some changes. Stories from long ago start to emerge because the long-term memory is there. I've had people that started to speak in their native language that they knew as a child. And that posed some challenges for people because they didn't know that language, but it was fun to be able to see how we could link that together. And keep in mind, there are going to be some profound moments of clarity when all of a sudden that person is there in a way that you recognize and you can appreciate. And what we want to do is try to create those moments where people can start to connect. Obviously, music is a big thing, and I'm going to be talking more about that because that brings the whole brain into function. And so as a result, many times a song that is familiar can be sung by that person. You can join singing those things together, and that's a way of connecting. I had a woman who was essentially nonverbal for well over a year. Family came to visit her, but one day her great granddaughter or great child brought her daughter. So they wanted to take this multi-generation picture. That's the bottom line. And they wanted her there. And they placed this infant in her arms, and she started to talk. Mothering had been a huge part of her life. She had been raised in a large family, the oldest of the children, and she had been a caregiver to those smaller children in her family. And she did everything mothers do. She cooed, she talked, she laughed. How are you? I mean, it was profound. And after the family left, she continued to talk for a couple hours and then just faded back. So there are all sorts of ways that we can connect. We just need to find that person. So many times those lost abilities will reemerge if we're giving them the right stimulus to have that come forward and we get those glimpses. The changes are going to be more pronounced, obviously, as the disease continues. We need to be aware that we're going to see those physical changes. We're going to see those verbal changes. We're going to see those memory changes. And the care role becomes more physically demanding because more and more we're starting to pick up where they can't do the things or recall how to do the things that have been so familiar for them. And it's very important that we start to acknowledge those changes and that we start to make plans for those changes rather than fighting and resisting them or acting like we're surprised that those changes did occur. And one of the things that you will notice that more and more, you're not only picking up some of the physical aspects of the care, but you are also going to be taking on a more profound role as an advocate for care because the person may be having difficulty speaking for themselves. but never underestimate the demand that this puts on you. Often people are acting like they can be superhuman and that I'm going to be able to do this. I know that we can do this. Maybe you've got other family members involved as well. But you need to take a realistic view and really come to a place where you are acknowledging the toll that it may be taking on you. In this particular clip, Mary shares about her dad and how his reaction to the ongoing care that he had to offer to his mother impacted his life as she was able to observe it.
My dad is, he's an interesting character. He's very type A. My father is one of the most decorated living Vietnam War veterans alive today. He's a retired colonel and very patriotic. My mother would say he was a stud. I mean, he's just really strong in character as well as and physically. And the stress of dealing with all of the decisions and the impact of her behavior, the impact of having her with them, displaying this behavior over months and months has actually really impacted my dad physically, to the point where I got married last year, and my husband has yet to see the dad that I grew up with because he's actually having some health problems that I know the stress of this disease have had on my dad. And my dad's my very best friend. So it's amazing that something that impacted my grandmother, who meant the world to all of us, has actually had such a huge impact on this guy who is just rock hard. It's been really difficult.
Taking care of yourself is a priority. I've often had to sit with a caregiver and say, if you don't take care of you, we're going to lose you before we lose them. And so you need to start to look carefully at what are some of the things that are not only presently impacting your life, but that will continue to grow in their impact. Self-care is huge. And stress can be cumulative. If you look at an airplane, and they're amazing pieces of equipment, before that plane ever starts to fly commercially or for anybody, they put them to a test and they stress test them. That's why they know that after so many air miles, they need to come in and be checked. After so many air miles, this particular piece needs to be switched out. Why? Because they don't wait for a failure. That would be catastrophic. They stress test these things because stress is cumulative. And I see many times that there are caregivers that are actually demonstrating what I call stress fractures. They're putting way too much weight on themselves. So you need to surround yourself with support, and we'll talk more about what that looks like. There are all sorts of ways that you can get support. You don't have to be the superhuman, but you need to practice some of those basic self-cares. So tip number one is the self remains, is not lost. And then we'll be talking about some other tips as we go through it, but remember the self remains, and it's important that you do some good self-care. So how does this communication start to change? That's the biggest impact. Well, the verbal is switching to the nonverbal. You're going to be more an interpreter or a decoder of clues or cues than you are a listener to actual verbal exchanges. And you start to learn how, and you need to learn how, to determine what these cues mean, what it is that this self is trying to communicate to you. And that is not always easy. I'm not saying that's something that you can do, just instantly. But be in the moment with the person. Right now, we're having a conversation and you're actually thinking about multiple things. And you may actually be multitasking, although I think we probably have proven that multitasking isn't all that effective. But the bottom line is you're holding multiple thoughts all at the same time. That is not necessarily true for a person who is in the late stages. They're holding one thought, they're probably very focused, and they're giving you some cues along the way as to what it is either they need, they desire, what is bringing them happiness. All of those things need to be interpreted by you. Elizabeth's going to talk a little about this.
What we learned from the experts is that a person's sensory abilities are still intact. So you can do a lot of things with them and engage them, such as a hand massage or aroma types of therapy, or playing a favorite song, or singing to them, or reading to them. So there's all sorts of things you can still do, even at the very last stages of dementia.
So it's important for us to always remember that we have the fully functioning brain, and we do not ask them to come and join us. It is our responsibility and our joy to be able to join them and to figure out what it is they're trying to communicate with us. And just know that sometimes their responses may not be congruent with what we would think would be a typical response. That's because they too are trying to find a way to connect. And maybe part of that retrieval process of what they're trying to connect with and put on the outside isn't necessarily congruent with what you would expect the response to be. So we're going to use more of our senses. We're going to learn how to communicate without words. We're going to start to read their facial expressions, and know this, they're going to be also reading your facial expressions. Touch is very important, but we also need to understand that there may be cultural norms. Some cultures are way more touchy than other cultures. And so we need to take that into account as well. Sounds are wonderful, but we need to watch for their response to the sounds. A television playing in the background may be a big distraction to them because they can't figure out where this person is, who's telling this, or what they're trying to get from it. So we need to be very, very aware of how that sensory bombardment is taking place on their ears. We're sorting sounds all the time, but that becomes really, really a challenge. And then there's body language. They're reading our body language, and we're going to be reading their body language for sure. Now, we need to come to understand what their perspective is. Remember, they are amazing observers, but poor interpreters. Not that they don't want to interpret, but it gets a little jumbled, but they are watching you very, very closely. They're listening to you very, very closely. And so doing whatever you can do to enhance that communication is going to be important. You also need to look at how you're responding. I've had people who have over the years said, this person has some pretty profound behaviors. And they go, I'm not too sure that they have the profound behavior. I wonder if they're mirroring your behavior. You're having a difficult day. You're being short. You're seeming to be in a rush. And that is getting interpreted by them, but they don't say, oh man, Mary's having a tough day. No, they go, okay, what am I supposed to do? I must be involved in this in some way. It's very interesting. I've had complete nonverbal conversation exchanges with people in late stages. And that is simply by getting within their private space by permission. Don't come quickly and surprise them, because the startle reflex is going to get a response, but getting in their visual field and just making sure that they can start to see me. And then I smile. And they smile back. I've winked. And they wink back. I kind of give that expression of surprise, oh, wow. And they give the same expression back. Isn't this what we do when we're talking many times? If a person goes, I'm really excited about this, you don't sit there and go, oh, good for you. You're like, really? What's happening? You're giving back a nonverbal response as well as a verbal response, and we're communicating. In fact, when your eyes light up, it means more to me than probably the words you said. And so there are all sorts of ways that we can start to communicate and connect with this person. Let's listen again to Martha as she talks about how to spend time together.
In the late stages of Alzheimer's disease and at the end of life, I think one of the things that can be most difficult for caregivers is to know how to spend time with their loved one.
How can their time with their loved one still be valuable, even without the ability to connect through language? People in the late stages still respond to touch, they respond to smell, they often respond to music. So in the late stages, I think it can be helpful for family members to remember what their loved one used to really enjoy. Perhaps there was a song that was their favorite song, or perhaps there was a lotion that they really loved. And when you go to spend time with them, play that song or simply hold their hand.
Powerful. How to spend time together, how to connect, how to be in the present with them. And knowing things about them are going to help you to do that. So if the first tip is that the self isn't lost, the second tip is that we need to connect with the self through the senses. I'm going to give you another little vignette, and I'm like full of stories. Obviously, had a lot of experience that I just thoroughly enjoy. But years and years ago, some of you probably could identify with this, when you went to Ben Franklin or Woolworth or Kresge's or the dime store, remember that? There was this little blue bottle, and girls bought this, and it contained this unbelievable perfume called Evening in Paris. I actually found a place where I could still get Evening in Paris when I was in my memory community. And so I knew we were going to be doing some things around senses, and the sense of smell is very important. It evokes all sorts of memories. And so I brought this to our small group of ladies one day when we were sitting there. We were going to do some communication through the senses. And I held up this little bottle. I can't say that I got a whole lot of recognition when people looked at the bottle. But when I took the lid off and I put a little bit on a Kleenex and I passed it in front of their noses, amazing responses. Eyes lit up. People who are generally not talking, all of a sudden were talking little bits about a date or whatever, all because it was a smell that associated with a deep sense of memory that elicited a verbal response. And I wasn't necessarily looking for the verbal response, but I thought just that smell may bring joy to their lives. For some people, it's the smell of baking bread. For some, it's sauerkraut, hard to believe. But all of those types of ways, utilizing just that one sense of smell to communicate and to connect with a person can be profound. Now, recognizing family and friends is one of the pain points. You walk in and they don't recognize who you are. Now, you can either be hurt, you can be upset, and you go, I've been married to this person for 55 years. What's wrong with this picture? Don't be offended. Start where you would start if you and I were meeting maybe for the first time. Extend your hand. We have an automatic social skill that's been built into us for absolutely since, you were 3, when your parents looked at you and said, shake their hand. Reach out and see if you can shake their hand, and then introduce yourself. And don't introduce yourself as, hi, Joe, I'm Helen, your wife. Say, hi, Joe, I'm Helen, and start to build from there. Knowing that someone is important to him or her is common. They may be able to have that sense that you are not just an average Joe coming and talking to them. You seem to be engaged with them. You seem to care about them, and you're tender towards them. All of those things are going to start to connect with that self. And again, keep in mind that they're experiencing the world through the senses, and they're really watching your face more than listening and decoding your words. See if we can get this slide to change. Intimacy is an issue. And when I say intimacy, I'm talking about that sense of closeness that you've had maybe with that person for a long, long time. And you may actually start to grieve that loss of intimacy, and that is perfectly normal. And you may be grieving not just the fact that the person seems to be distancing from you, but you may be grieving the fact that you didn't think this would ever be happening to you. You may be grieving the fact that this wasn't on your to-do list, and by this point you thought you would be living in Arizona and enjoying warmer winters. You may be grieving the fact that your circle of friends has started to dwindle because people don't know how to relate to what you're going through or how you're having to care for this person, or that you're no longer as flexible as you used to be. And I mean, yes, there are many, 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 many different layers to this. And guess what? It's okay. It's really okay. And it's okay to feel some of these like simultaneously. But what is important is that we don't necessarily take that out on the person that we so desire to be intimately close to. And I've seen that sometimes with caregivers kind of start to resent the fact that they're doing cares and that their life has been so tipped on its end. So you need to process that with somebody. And again, good self-care, being able to connect with somebody so you can talk through those feelings and you can process is very, very important, so that you can stay focused on the fact that it's still possible to connect and have an intimate, ongoing relationship with this person who I know you deeply care about. And here again is where we often draw upon the power of touch, because that sense of connection is so vitally important. And it keeps us in the present with that person. No, don't do that. Come on, be nice to me. So what we want to do is start to focus on meaningful activities, things that are connecting at this moment. Look at the remaining abilities that the person has. Don't start to think I need to teach them something new, or I'm going to try to stretch what they can do. Keep them comfortably in the abilities that they do have. Incorporate music. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Spend some time outside, except for on a day like this, maybe, but some people love warm weather. And by the way, many people in late stages are cold all the time. And that's why you may go, what in the world? They've got this heavy jacket on. We're sitting outside and it's 88 degrees. They're cold. Their thermostat isn't working. But it's important, even if they're out there, that they're being hydrated, all those types of things we could talk about. And then be sure to modify those activities. Let's talk about music for a second. And because we're also going to hear a clip from Melanie talk about music, she and I could be best friends, I think. This is a very, very important way to connect with people. I had a little gentleman, and his wife was actually in memory care. Her cares exceeded his ability to be able to provide good care for her. And she was not easy. She was very challenging at times, but 3 days a week he came, and they would sit down on the couch and watch Polka Spotlight. Anybody remember this? They loved polkas. Now, let me tell you, when he sat down on that couch and that came on, she just snuggled with him. It was so dang adorable. It was just unbelievable. She was transplanted to a different time, a different dimension of their lives that they had enjoyed together. Had a gentleman who was very, very quiet. But one day we decided to put some hymns on. And this man sang and had the most glorious voice. I kid you not. It was absolutely amazing. And this happened day after day after day. And so one day his daughter was in, and I looked, I said, oh my word, your dad has this amazing voice. She looked at me and said, did you hear him sing when he was the choir director at church? Or I said, no, I hear him sing here all the time. She was shocked because her dad was generally quiet when she was there. And also he never sang. I said, come tomorrow at 10. We're going to do our hymn sing-along. She said, I will make it a point to be here. She walked through the door and she heard that voice. She started to cry. She couldn't believe her ears. Those familiar songs ignited that brain, and he would sing, sing, sing. I had a gentleman who had sold musical instruments for Schmidt Music, and you put band music on, oh my word, he was alive. He would try to stand up. We would get him on his feet. We could never get him to move, and he would dance. There's just power in music, a favorite song, an era of music. All of those things tap into people's deep, deep memories and incorporate multiple places in the brain. So I just really encourage you, never underestimate the power of music. Let's listen to Melanie, my new best friend.
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there about music and its value with people with Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm a former music therapist, so I happen to really have strong feelings about this, and of course, think that music is a wonderful intervention, not only for people with Alzheimer's, but for most people. But some of the things that are special about music, first of all, music is processed not just in one part of the brain, but all over the brain, because it involves words and memory. It involves rhythm. It involves long-term memory, because when you hear a song, think about it. You often will think about where you were when you first heard that song, or people that enjoyed that music. So on a lot of levels, music can be very therapeutic. When I was a practicing music therapist, I would use music therapy in many, many ways. One was to help people to remember their past. So if I could tap into songs and music that they had strong memories associated with, it could be incredibly powerful. Another way would be to almost manipulate people's moods a bit. Because often, what the anecdotal thing that you hear out there all the time is that if you want to calm a person down, you put on calm music, and nothing could be further from the truth. A little music therapy trick is that if you are working with someone who's quite agitated, you want to play loud music that gets their attention. So loud music with a very heavy beat to get their attention, because it's meeting the person where they're at. And then you slowly go to music that's softer and softer and softer. And if you're skilled enough, you can actually use that to calm people, or conversely, to help stimulate people.
Music, don't underestimate it. I'm going to refer back to it in just a moment when we talk here about caregiving, because of its multiple stimulation properties. As the disease progresses, obviously more cares are going to be augmented by us. But we want to preserve the person's dignity, and we want to include them as much as possible in their own caregiving. And so one of the things that I sometimes when I'm doing training, I'll have a person stand up and have them come up to me, and I'll say, oh, here, and I reach out and I'm going to start to unbutton their blouse. And of course, the first response is they pull right back. They're like, what, are you a pervert or what? I go, just imagine now you don't remember who I am. And somebody walks up to you and they're starting to unbutton your blouse or your shirt. And they're reaching towards your belt on your pants. And they're acting like they want to pull your pants down. What do you think that response is going to be? So what we need to do is start to give all sorts of cues and clues to the person in late stage to help them initiate on their own the actions. And they do that many times by imitating us. So if I want a person to take off their shirt because they're going to get ready for a shower, I'll go, okay, let's start to take off our shirt and act like I'm unbuttoned. Can you unbutton? Do you need some help? And then I'll tap their shirt. The response is usually way different than if I start to try to do this on their behalf. And I let them to do it as much as they can. Sometimes it's very slow. And this is one of the things in late stages to keep in mind. Speed doesn't work. Rushing doesn't work. So you have to leave that time. So they're going to imitate your actions as much as possible. Now for a person who is capable of brushing their teeth, maybe they can't get the toothpaste out of the tube, but they're able to brush their teeth. Usually the next step is you walk in and you find out that the toothbrush is being used in the hair. It's because it's a brush. And you go, this isn't going to work. So then you put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and you put your hand over theirs and you guide it to their mouth and start that motion. Now that repetitive motion that has been done for decades is going to start to engage with that self, and they're going to be able to take it forward from there. You want to talk through the process? No surprises. You go, well, I don't think they understand me anyway. No, talk through the processes. Don't be surprised. They probably are understanding more. It's the decoding that's the challenge, but given some time, it starts to get in there. And using that hand over hand technique may be a way then that you have to ultimately do it for them, but don't take it away from them. I know it would be so much easier. You just go, I'm going to brush their teeth for them. No, maybe you're doing 99% of the work, but allow them still to be engaged, preserve their dignity, and allow them to be a part of the process. It's very, very important. I had a woman who I just so admire, because getting her husband into the shower was just an enormous challenge. He just wouldn't go there. And so she said, I'm talking to him and, but her husband, again, connected in that realm of music. So she took songs that he knew and she put the instructions into the song, kind of like fun they would have. So instead of "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," she would look at him and say, "You are my sunshine, and take a shower. We'll take a shower and make us glad." And he did. Who knew? But because she fired up some other parts of his brain and was communicating with him, it worked. So we need to somehow figure out how to do these things. Had a gentleman who just, he could still walk, but when he stood up, and so we had care people who were always around him, and then he would just stand and could hardly get going. And one day I said, you know what, why don't you do something rhythmically with him? Like, take a step, 1, 2, take a step, 1, 2. And you know what? He took a step, 1, 2, and he could start to walk. So there are multiple ways that we can include the person in the care that we're providing, in the outcomes that we're looking for that are for their well-being, rather than doing it all for them and taking it away from them. I strongly encourage to keep that person self-connected as much as possible. So tip number 3 is simply involve the person in the care that you are providing. Keep them connected. One last little story. I had a lady that every time we took her to have a shower done, she was totally cooperative, but the moment the water turned on, she screamed so loud she could be heard in the parking lot. Okay. And it was very disconcerting. I mean, it was disconcerting to the resident, it was disconcerting to obviously the care team. And they're like, wow, but what was interesting is she didn't seem to be afraid or resisting. So again, we sat with the family and said, this is happening. Talk to us about your mother and water. My mother loves water. I mean, she was raised at the lake. She's been swimming since she's probably been 3. She taught all of us to swim. She loves swimming. She loves water. In reality, she was trying to express her pleasure. She could have been in the shower 3 times a day and just been totally delighted. Not good for the skin, but she'd been totally delighted. And part of the clue was we picked up on a cue, because she would point at her head. And what she was saying is, run the water on my head. Point on her shoulder, run the water on my shoulder. Because, it's one of these handheld jobbies. Now, she screamed the entire time. So there are some things late stage people can't do. They can't really hold 2 thoughts simultaneously. And so to kind of eliminate some of that disruption, not her delight, she also loved gum. So we gave her a piece of gum just before we started to shower, and she would focus on chewing the gum and delighting in the shower, all at the same time, picking up on those clues. Keep in mind that we're now moving to around-the-clock care. It can be pretty demanding, pretty stressful. And so there need to probably be some decisions about long-term care or additional services. You need to start to look at ways to bring in help. One person cannot do this all. The person that you may be caring for sleeps 12 to 18 hours a day, and then they may be up all night long walking around. So we need to be aware of that stress fracture and how it interplays with daily needs, getting supportive services to help, family members to assist. All of those decisions need to start to be made, and you need to be having open communication about that. And you need to be having close communications with physicians for sure about any marked changes. Anytime you would see a marked change in a person's ability to, have mobility, you need to communicate that. When you notice there's a change in any forms of communication, they seem to be showing some sort of pain, like they wince when they move. All of those types of things are very, very important to communicate because they could be clues of something that's happening. And we need to focus on the quality of life. We're really, at this point, looking at focusing on the quality of their life. We're not going to cure something. We're not going to take them to a new level, but we just want to make sure that they are well cared for, they're comfortable, that they're staying connected with you, and you are feeling like you're able to do the portions that are fit for your capability, and that you also have the ability to look for other resources. I know many times caregivers have made promises, and we'll talk more about that in the next session. They've made promises, but those promises need to be reevaluated in light of what you're presently experiencing. Oh, I love this. There we go. So what are some of the things that you really should start to take notice of? We want to monitor eating. Monitoring eating is very, very important. Obviously, the nutrition that a person receives is vital, but there are going to be all sorts of changes even in that aspect. So monitor weight changes. Gradual weight decline is to be expected, but if there were a sudden weight loss, you would certainly want to report that. You can expect that there are going to be swallowing difficulties. That's very, very common with people because of the whole connection with the brain and the need to communicate. A very complex procedure swallowing is. And so because of the ability to swallow being many times impaired, you need to look at having thickened liquids, a mechanical soft diet, pureed or things like that. And you can start with preparing at first. Maybe it's difficult for them to even hold a fork and they can't self-feed. I always tell people, cut up their food outside of their visual field. You don't want to be sawing away like they're a 1-year-old and you're getting the food ready for them, but bring something that's already in pieces. Allow that maybe to be finger food for them. You cannot rush a person who is eating, by the way. I've had people say, well, the plate was there for 30 minutes and I finally cleared the table. I just didn't have all day. Was there some reason? Was there like a 30-minute time limit on the meal? Could they have sat there for the next hour and a half and picked at their food and gotten the food that they wanted? So just be prepared. And there may be a point where you really need to work with, a physician or a nutritionist to be sure that we're getting the right caloric amounts in that person, and there are ways to supplement those. And we need to be aware of those changing expectations as it relates to what they're going to eat, how they eat. Truly, fewer calories are needed by people at this stage. Part of it is because their bodies are not processing a lot of the food. And know this, that their tastes and preferences may change. I've had people who never liked a certain food, all of a sudden love the food. And some of the times we need to enhance the flavor of the food. We need to add some sugar, believe it or not, something that they can taste. So we just need to be aware of those changes and monitor those changes. Walking, sitting, and standing are going to obviously change. And because the cognitive controls the physical, there are going to be things that they once did that they're not going to be able to do. We're going to notice a change in their gait. That puts a person at risk for falls by virtue of their balance as well. There are times that people don't recall that they no longer are really walking or capable of walking. And so they attempt to stand up and they fall. It's all those things we need to be mindful of for sure. And we need to take some steps to ensure that the person is able to continue to function safely. Again, we talked about using utensils that they're able to hold on to. There are all sorts of different utensils that are very helpful. And, you know, sitting and smiling are affected by that late stage. You may say they never smile anymore. They may be very flat in affect, but that is to be expected. That's okay. They don't need to just belly laugh and smile at you now every time. Let me give you a couple tips, because I've had people who say, well, I'm going to put chair alarms on this person. What I tell people often is that chair alarm lets you know the person fell. I mean, unless you're going to have eyes on them constantly, there is no chair alarm that tells you preemptively, unless they're kind of rocking to get out of the chair. The other thing is that you need to be very mindful of that you don't have an alarm that necessarily is distracting to them. Have it be something, they have them now, where they can be a little clip on your belt and they vibrate when that's happening, because the startle reflex is so strong many times with people that squealing sound impacts them and actually contributes more to their stress and to some of their reactions. And I've had people who heard the sound and jumped up and fell. So just all sorts of things that we need to be aware of as it relates to some of those things. Toileting becomes a major issue. Let me give you a little tidbit right before we launch into all these things. You may want to explore a bidet, and it's easier to get a person to use a bidet in earlier stages so they're used to it. That certainly helps with this personal hygiene issue, okay? But you're going to notice that it's very difficult for the person to know when and how to use the bathroom or the toilet. It's impaired. And there are all sorts of things to keep in mind. Obviously, pericare is huge because we don't want UTIs. A lot of men later in life have an enlarged prostate. And so as a result, they have an urgency to go and use the bathroom, or they use the bathroom. And then I've had people say, I don't get it, man. They just went to the bathroom and 5 minutes later, they went again. Yeah, because they have an enlarged prostate. And when they emptied their bladder, they had the sensation that they emptied their bladder, but there may have been actually 1 to 2 cups of water or liquid still left in the bladder. And all of a sudden it goes, I got to get out of this. So just knowing some of those things are helpful. So the individual is going to have an increasing need for assistance with this, and incontinence is a normal part of this stage for sure. And you need to work obviously with your physician to ensure there are no other causes for the person's incontinence, like an infection or whatever. But here are a few little tidbits I would give. Keep track of how frequently this person is toileting, because you could maybe develop a toilet schedule for them, and that can increase the likelihood that you're not going to have to clean something up that you weren't prepared to. So you go, you know, it seems like an hour after they eat, they need to go use the bathroom. Well, let's put this in motion so that it's on the schedule. Obviously, using incontinence products is very important. Not all incontinence products are created equal. You want things that definitely wick away and keep a person dry, because we don't want any skin breakdown. You do want to monitor those bowel movements, because if the person is ever constipated, it's very, very likely you're going to start to see some implications related to constipation because the person is uncomfortable. Identify when accidents occur. I mean, are you seeing a frequent recurring theme in the accident realm? And be sure that the person consumes ample fluids. I've had people say, well, I just reduced the amount. No. You want to keep them hydrated. They're going to be dehydrated most of the time anyway. So cutting down on their fluids is not necessarily a good thing to do. And also provide visual cues to the bathroom. Most of our homes, we turn the light off in the bathroom. Sometimes we even close the door. Your house is a mystery to you. You can't find it. Keep the door open on the bathroom. Actually keep a light on there. Maybe increase the wattage, putting the lamp on the vanity so it lights the toilet very explicitly so that it can be seen by them. And you're going to provide some visual cues as it relates to the bathroom. And then in the process, remove any obstacles. I've been in bathrooms that, my goodness, you almost had to be a gymnast, not only to get into, but they had the shower chair, they had the toilet riser, they had it can get really complicated. But how did the person ever expect somebody to get in there that wasn't processing all of that information? And then sometimes you need to provide reminders about using the bathroom, or say, I feel like I need to go use the bathroom. How about you? Don't say, it's time for you to go to the bathroom. It's just not going to work, okay? You need to also continue to work very, very diligently with your doctors. I'm not going to cover this in great detail, but you want to be sure to report anything that could possibly be a sign of an infection, because you want to be able to get that treated as quickly as possible. Like I said, sudden weight changes, if there's a distinct change in their appetite, thirst, all those things, and any sort of bladder or bowel changes, smell in the urine, those types of things you want to report as quickly as possible. There are some medications that are easily given by a physician that can help a person in their outcomes. Electrolyte balance is a frequent issue, and it can appear in various ways: nausea, cramping, muscle spasms, those kind of things. And as a result, it's easily treated. Pneumonia, we know, is going to be a threat for these people because they can aspirate food. And so being prepared to report early and get treatment is important. And UTIs, urinary tract infections, all of those things are important. Bed sores is a topic unto itself. It is a complete topic. Red spots, particularly in bony areas, because now the person may be in a chair for multiple hours or in a bed for multiple hours. This can be life-threatening. So when you see a spot on a bony area, you need to obviously take a good look and you need to report that. I know many times we feel guilty and say, well, it's because of poor hydration or poor nutrition. You may be serving the most amazing meals. You may be putting, beverages within their reach and helping them sip on a straw and everything else, and keeping them as clean as possible from any incontinence, making sure that moisture is wicked away. It's a challenge. It is just a challenge. So I just encourage you that, wherever there's prolonged pressure or friction from moving, there's a propensity. Aging skin is just thinner, a higher likelihood. Lack of ability to sense pain. They may have hurt themselves or scratched themselves and not even be aware of it. The weight loss, they're getting less nutrition. The body isn't metabolizing the nutrition. Like I talked about, incontinence, all of these types of things, medical conditions that are affecting circulation. This is huge. All of these interplay with the creation of bed sores. And I hate to be so morbid, but bed sores can be fatal. And they can develop very quickly and go very profoundly, in not only in size, but in depth. I know that there are certain things that we highly recommend people do. And that is that if they're in a chair, that they get repositioned about every 15 minutes. Then there is the other old rule, and they say old, that, if they're in bed, they need to be repositioned every 2 hours. Quite frankly, we know now the science is well documented that 2 hours is probably too long. That was established by Florence Nightingale. And when they asked her why she had that as kind of a common practice, she said, it took me 2 hours to do my rounds. Now we know that whole skin and tissue breakdown takes place much faster. So there are some amazing things out there to help alleviate this. And it isn't just the pillow stuffing. There's the Q2 roller and the hover mat that are amazing at adjusting a person's position by just a few degrees, which take the pressure off and can help alleviate some of these issues related to bed sores. So you want to look in particular for red spots on bony areas and blisters or open skin. You want to report that immediately. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Some other symptoms you may see are hallucinations, seeing or sensing things that are not there, delusions, believing things that are not real, like you stole my purse. And you're going to see some possible agitation or aggression, but we could see that as a clue to some other physical reality that is playing like pain or discomfort. Late stage medications that can be given, the standard ones, and we'll hear in a moment from an expert far beyond me, may have an impact. Remember, they're only symptom management, but they're not necessarily all that effective. But there are some other medications that may need to be introduced on what I would just call an episodic basis. So listen to Ron Peterson, the expert on this.
A more vexing problem that can occur in the setting of Alzheimer's disease is the situation that involves with paranoia, delusional thinking, someone stealing money from me, taking my purse, taking my personal goods, or actually aggression. This, in fact, can be such an important factor that it may affect the person's ability to remain in a particular living situation. That is, if the person becomes dangerous to him or herself, dangerous to the other residents in the facility or to the staff, sometimes the person has to be moved. So these are very difficult problems to deal with, and the medications are only partially effective. Generally, we'll be talking about drugs such as antipsychotics or so-called neuroleptics, like the more typical ones, haloperidol. Sometimes the newer ones, such as olanzapine and quetiapine, can be effective in this situation. However, the data in the literature indicate that there's very little hard evidence that these medications actually are effective in the setting of Alzheimer's disease. In addition, for example, with the atypical neuroleptics, there's a so-called black box warning in the PDR, meaning that these drugs actually may have serious side effects, such as increasing what's called all-cause mortality, death, in these individuals if you use them in an unsupervised fashion. So the bottom line with regard to the use of these drugs, these are very serious behaviors that have to be managed one way or another. If behavioral manipulations have not been effective, we might have to turn to these medications. But in these situations, it's incumbent upon the physician to have a discussion with the patient and the family so they understand all of the risks, all the potential benefits, use these drugs at a very low dose, monitor them very carefully, and of course document everything in the medical record with respect to these discussions. The risks and the benefits have been weighed in using these medications.
I so appreciate his perspective. I've just seen many times that physicians throw a medication, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, because we're all desperate to try to alleviate a situation, even when it could potentially put an individual at risk as it relates to staying in their own home with care or having to go to another place or even being discharged from that place. But we need to look at all of the behavioral approaches and make sure that we've tried as many as possible before we take this step with medications. They can be effective, but sometimes they're not. Let's continue with monitoring care, and we'll start to wrap up here. If you start to see some mobility problems, This is something that you would definitely want to communicate, as I said, with a physician. If you see a sudden onset of rigidity, where the arms get really stiff, this could be an interaction with a medication that needs to be reported. A restlessness could be a sign of pain and discomfort that is, not being addressed, and we want to keep the person as pain-free as possible. Changes in sleeping patterns, difficulty breathing, that could be a pneumonia. I mean, various things. So suddenly, as a caregiver, you're monitoring several different things, and that's why this is a very complex journey for sure. Pain management, I just referenced to, we want to keep them as pain-free in the late stages. They're not necessarily accurate reporters or good reporters. You're going to have to decode the cues. And I've had people who say hurt, hurt, hurt. And when we where do you hurt? Trying to figure that out. By the way, they just can't, on a scale where you hold up the happy face, the sad face, that type of thing, on a scale of 1 to 10, they can't do it. And so as a result, we try to figure different ways to do pain assessment. And they pointed at their left shoulder. And in 5 minutes, we asked them, because they kept saying hurt, 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 they pointed at their knee. Now, it's quite possible all those areas hurt. And maybe we just need to give them something to have general relief for some pain. But we need to have several sets of eyes on this person looking at these things. To keep that person healthy, we want to moisturize the skin as much as possible. We need to learn how to lift them. You don't want to be grabbing them under their arms and hoisting them up in bed, because that could bring skin shear. So we need to learn how to lift effectively. Getting in touch with a physical therapist would be very, very vital here. We want to work and maintain their range of motion, helping move their arms and legs, and keep the person moving as much as possible, because that's also good for the bowel. And we want to clean any areas that are suspicious and treat them, make sure they get their flu shots, and obviously talk with a physician about drastic changes. Touch on this momentarily. It's inevitable that somewhere along the line, there will be some form of crisis that probably requires a trip to the emergency room. You want to think this through before it ever occurs. You want to obviously communicate with care partners. You want to have a list of who you call in a crisis, and you want to have a firm understanding of the DNR orders that should have been put in place before the late stage, if at all possible. And then you also want to be able to have a list of their medications handy, all of those types of things that can sometimes get lost in the translation of a rush. And so have them in places where you can easily access them. And then have some sense of the choices regarding the treatments. Advanced directives, are they in place? Do you have that information handily available? Maybe a guardianship needs to be put in place. And this can be done through the court, and we'll talk about that more in the second session. Let's listen to Kitty, who is on the journey with her husband.
Advice that I would give other caregivers, if they're caring for any individual with any type of disease, but mostly Alzheimer's, is to really make sure that they take a portion of time for themselves, because it can become all consuming. And if you're not able and on the spot, you're not going to be able to provide the care that's so desperately needed. So the idea of providing care for yourself as well, and finding time for yourself, respite care for yourself, is very, very important. Unless you are able and healthy, you can't provide that for someone else. It's not an easy job. And it is a 24-hour, 36-hour-a-day job.
You can't do it alone. Not anymore, you can't. And here's the thing that's ugly about this disease. Kitty's husband obviously probably had an early onset, and she's a little younger. But imagine somebody who's moving into the late stages in their late 70s or early 80s, and the spouse is the person who's going to be the primary caregiver, and they too are in their late 70s or early 80s. We know energy, stamina, the ability to cope with all of these types of additional responsibilities is going to be a huge challenge. So you can't do this alone anymore. So today we talked about maintaining that sense of self, that way to communicate using those sensory elements that are accessible to us to be able to link with that true self, the idea of preserving a person's dignity while providing that physical care. And then repeatedly, we talked about that you need to do good self-care as well. So when I started the session, I talked about the birthday party, remember? Now that we've talked about what we've talked about today, instead of walking away and thinking, oh, well, I guess they don't remember, what would you do differently? What are some of the steps that you would take to connect with that person? Would it be to remember a song that was sung at that birthday party or played at that birthday party? Would it be to recall the chocolate cake and kind of tantalize and tease those senses? What would you do differently to stay connected? So I hope that you've gleaned some invaluable insights today and that you're going to be able to do the journey with the person until the day we let them go. Thanks for listening.